Hello everyone, I'm Inverse, and today we are going to be taking a look at a very unique and very powerful Wehrmacht build order developed by two extremely talented Wehrmacht players, Aimstrong and Tommy. It is a 4-pioneer start with a support unit emphasis and a blitz doctrine follow-up, and we'll see how these three kind of unique aspects actually combine into something that is both extremely practical and extremely intelligent. So with that in mind, let's get things started here. This first game is going to be Aimstrong against a Smurf on Langres, and as we see straight away, queuing up the four pioneers. We're just going to speed things up a little bit since the early game is simply capping around. Now the capping order, I'm not going to go too much into depth on the capping order. With 4 pioneers, you can be very flexible with how you cap the map. You have a lot of units that can cap the map fairly quickly, and you're going to get into your opponent's territory fairly quickly as well, so your capping order is going to be largely reactionary based on what your opponent is capping, where your opponent is sending his early rifle squads, things like that, because you obviously do not have too much offensive potential with these 4 pioneers against early rifle squads. It delays your tier 1 units, so you're going to have to be cautious, and you're going to have to be intelligent with how you cap around the map. So you can see up here being very defensive, over here hopping in this building being very defensive as well. Now as we see, we have an MG coming out of the Wehrmacht quarters first. This Wehrmacht quarters was built by the 4th pioneer, the final pioneer that was built out of this Wehrmacht, out of the headquarters rather. And if you build the Wehrmacht quarters with that 4th pioneer, you actually have right around 250 manpower by the time that Wehrmacht quarters is finished, which is an extremely nice timing and fits in well with this strategy. Now we have a bike follow-up. That's the 2nd unit in the build. The general build, I'll just go over that really quickly. It is the 4-pio start, and then bike, MG, 4-pio start, MG bike, MG sniper. As you can see, very support unit heavy, and we'll go over the theory behind that in a little while, because there's one thing that's very important to this strategy, and that's mine placement. Mine placement, of course, very important to almost any Wehrmacht strategy, but it is especially important for strategies that rely so heavily on support units and so heavily on less mobile, far more fragile units. We don't have any Volk squads in this strategy. We're going to have some stormtroopers later in the game, but at this point we have 1 MG, we have a bike, we have a 2nd MG just about to pop out, and we have a bunch of pioneers. These are all very fragile units. When we look at the unit composition of our American opponent, most standard American openings, say 2 engineers to start off with and then 4 rifle squads, something like that, are going to have timings built into them just by the nature of how their builds progress, where you can actually do a lot of damage to a strategy that's very support heavy. Especially a strategy such as this, where the support units are heavily focused on MGs, which are of course extremely positional units and can be extremely difficult to use, and extremely difficult to use consistently. Consistency is one of the hallmarks of an extremely good player, and most good players don't like strategies that they cannot consistently win with. You don't want a strategy that relies on your opponent doing something, or relies on you playing absolutely perfectly, or relies on your opponent not playing perfectly. Things like that are generally not what you want to be focusing on in terms of strategies to use. And when we look at a support heavy strategy, the first thing that comes to mind is I can flank this. Any early sniper build can, generally speaking, be flanked. We're talking about just normal expected micro, no mines, nothing like that. An early sniper build is not very good at defending flanks. It's simple math. Snipers do not deal damage quickly, they deal damage over time. The quicker a flank, the less damage a sniper can deal, the less impact a sniper can have on that engagement. Now there's a few ways you can slow down engagements. The main reason, or the main method rather, is mines. Mines are extremely important if you want to slow down anything that your opponent is doing. You can slow down your opponent's tech because your opponent's going to have to be reinforcing a bit more. You can slow down your opponent's flanks because your opponent's going to be suppressed. Your opponent's going to be taking damage. It's going to be far easier for you to actually deal damage during your flanks. And you can actually defend against a little bit of your opponent's tech as well, which is something that we'll get into a little bit later, discussing the opponent's possible reactions and possible follow-ups to a strategy such as this. Now, I'm just going to pause things because we're 10 minutes into this game and I wasn't really focusing back at the base too much on the tech. But if we look, we already have tier 3 up, we already have a Puma out, and we're already getting an upgun. We look 10 minutes into the game. This Puma hit the field around the 9:30 mark. That's extremely quick. And when we look at what Aimstrong has on the field right now, it's an extremely powerful army, and it's an extremely cost-effective army. And that's the key to this strategy, is that it's extremely cost-effective and it's extremely tech-heavy. Now let's get this going again. And what I mean by that is, look at the units we have again. We have MGs, right? MGs have 3-man squads. They generally don't take too much damage because they have suppression. That's one of their features. And suppression by its nature reduces the amount of damage that units will deal to infantry, to the pioneers, to the MGs, stuff like that. Now we also have a sniper. Sniper obviously very cost effective. Not going to be reinforcing a sniper obviously. Rarely going to be reinforcing MGs as well, at least in comparison to something like a Volk squad, which is extremely expensive to reinforce and has to be reinforced constantly throughout the game. MGs very rarely have to be reinforced, and even then never have to reinforce more than 2 men at a time. Can also obviously be recruited and deal damage without taking manpower damage. They might take health damage, and because they're a 3-man squad, they can take a lot more health damage before they actually incur a loss to one of their squad members, whereas a Volk squad with perhaps similar health but more men in the squad isn't going to be able to sustain as much damage before having to reinforce. Now I'm going to pause just for a quick second here because this is a fairly quick game. We're almost near the end already, and a few very important things are going to occur in the next little while, but I still have a few things I want to discuss in terms of the general theory behind this strategy, because on top of it being extremely cost effective, it also denies your opponent veterancy. Now this is an important fact that a lot of players don't really take into consideration when thinking about what kind of build they want to do, and it's one of the reasons Volksvolk Sniper MG, which is another build that Aimstrong is very fond of, was so powerful. And if you watched my build order breakdown series on the Volksvolk Sniper MG strategy, this is something that I repeated a lot because it's very important, and it's a very important idea to keep in mind whenever you're developing a strategy, deciding on a strategy to use, something like that, is the less veterancy you can give your American opponent, the better. And that means you need to give your opponent less things to kill. Volk squads, they're fairly easy for rifle squads to kill, relatively speaking, of course. They give minimal veterancy experience, obviously, but you can kill a lot of them because they're cheap to reinforce and they're main combat units. They're not support units. MGs, on the other hand, intrinsically support units. Very rarely are you going to lose a man on an MG squad. If you're using mines and proper bike micro and stuff like that, you should almost never lose any men on an MG squad. And even if you do, you're losing very few relative to the number of Volks that you could be losing for the same cost. Because obviously Volks are more expensive than MGs, at least up front, though their reinforcement cost is not as expensive. But when you're playing a support-heavy strategy such as this, when we see a couple MGs and a sniper early game and a bike, these are units that you don't really kill a lot of. Maybe a rifle squad will get 1 or 2 kills in the early game. That's extremely unusual. Even if the American opponent plays an aggressive or semi-aggressive early game strategy, which our American player did not do so much in this game, but in the next game we'll see a slightly more aggressive variation of American play to counter this. It's not you don't give your opponent many targets to shoot at, and that reduces the amount of veterancy your opponent is going to get, and it also reduces the effectiveness of their infantry later on in the game. Now, the final thing before we get on with this game and view its epic conclusion is the tech angle. Generally, Wehrmacht players need to tech to tier 2 in order to be safe from things like M8s, from even some forms of bar aggression because Pumas may come too late, stuff like that. In this strategy, you're getting your tech far earlier because you're doing your best to secure 2 of these fuel points. As we can see in this game, Aimstrong, fortunate enough, played well enough to have these 2 fuel points. In the next game, we're going to see a situation where our Wehrmacht player maybe wasn't quite as set up to transition into the tier 3 phase, but still managed to do it anyways and still managed to get himself in decent footing. Now, the reason I say tech is so important and quality tech is so important is because a lot of people, when they think of tier 3 against M8, think of the American having the advantage, thinking, hey, motor pool tech, superior to Wehrmacht tier 3 tech. I am of the opinion, and watching a lot of the games with this strategy kind of hammers home the fact that Wehrmacht tier 3 is extremely powerful. The only scary part of the Wehrmacht tier 3 teching phase is that window of time when your opponent's first M8 comes out and you don't really have a lot to deal with in terms of counters. Now, Aimstrong gets around this with an upgun Puma, lots of mines, and a lot of the time stews. Of course, later on stews and stuff like that. But he gets around it with a lot of tier 3 anti-tank. We're going to see in the next game a slightly different take on motor pool defense with stormtroopers. But beyond that one scary point in time, upgun Pumas are superior to M8s in terms of 1-to-1. The upgun Puma will more often than not kill the M8. We have Stugs, which are very good against both tier 3 and tier 4 vehicles on the American side. We have Nebelwerfers, and we have obviously the Sniper and the Stormtrooper, which are both very good against the low squad size of the AT gun. So with that in mind, we will continue on with this game, and squads are going to die. This is something that Aimstrong is very comfortable with, that a lot of you watching may not be so comfortable with, and that's being extremely aggressive with tier 3 units. Tier 3 units are extremely powerful, and a lot of the time you can catch your opponent by simply being aggressive and forcing mistakes, and not only forcing mistakes and dealing damage, because in this case we'll see this may not have been a good idea. You can look at it from a purely mathematical what did Aimstrong kill versus what he lost kind of situation and say, hey, he might not have wanted to do this. But when we look at what this is forcing out of the American player, we're forcing attention, we're forcing units back at the base. If we look around here, looking on the tactical map, we have squads pushing forward to a cutoff point to gain position. We have squads capping around the map, once again to gain position. And we have a Stu coming in to get to work on some of these buildings. And this is a very key part of this strategy, and a key part of a lot of Blitzkrieg strategies these days is the sheer strength of the Stu and its ability to deal extreme damage to buildings extremely quickly. It takes 4 Stu shots to kill a barracks. It takes 3 Stu shots to kill a supply yard. That's extremely short in terms of time. And if your opponent is not prepared properly, if he maybe doesn't have stickies yet, or if you're able to snipe his AT gun and then move in with a Stu, you can actually snipe a lot of important tech buildings and force your opponent to rebuild, to waste time, and to waste resources. So that's going to be game 1 for that strategy. We're going to go on to game 2 very shortly, and I'll see you guys then. Alright guys, welcome back. Let us jump into game number 2. This is going to be a game played by Tommy this time, and we're going to see a little bit of variations, a little bit of stylistic differences, and we'll see how those affect the outcome of the game and affect how the strategy looks. Now before I get into this game, I'd just like to point out that both the games obviously were longer games. Now this strategy can definitely be effective on other maps, notably Samoa and Angleville. It can be very, very effective on those maps. However, it is my opinion based on watching a lot of these games, playing the strategy myself, and interacting with Tommy and Aimstrong, that Langra is almost certainly the best map for this strategy, and it is for that reason that I've decided to focus my analysis on Langra. If you'd like to see how this strategy plays out on other maps, I strongly encourage you to download and take a look at Tommy's Wehrmacht replay pack and the Wehrmacht games in Aimstrong's recent replay pack, which I will link in the description to this video. I highly recommend you check out those replay packs if you'd like to take a bit of a closer look at this strategy. I was going to say something else. What else was I going to say? Ah, that's going to drive me crazy. Oh yeah. Also, for people who have already watched Aimstrong's replay pack, you might have noticed, probably did notice, variations on follow-ups, and not strictly tier 3 follow-ups from Aimstrong. A lot more scouting with the bike and reacting to what he saw, most notably reacting with tier 2 and a pack to quick supply yard motor pool play based on what he scouted with his bike. For the purposes of this video, I feel the strategy is best played with the tier 3 follow-up. The games I've watched with a tier 3 follow-up were strongest, had the most dominating play, and just seemed like they played out a lot smoother than the tier 2 follow-up. So I've decided, much like I decided to focus on Langra with the map selection, to focus on tier 3 in terms of how we play out this strategy. Mostly to simplify things, to streamline things, and to focus things. Since I'm trying to keep these things below an hour, since I feel the last US vs PE case study was a little bit excessive in terms of length. Now this is something I really like, and this is something I think is very important to this strategy, is being very fluid and mobile with your MGs. And understanding that you don't necessarily have to have your MG set up at all times, and that it's perfectly fine, perfectly valid, and perfectly acceptable to actually have your MGs where they aren't actually set up. Have them waiting, have your bike, your Schwimmwagen defending and scouting, so that you don't waste time and waste health and anything like that on positioning your MG, say here, and then realizing, oh no, that was wrong. I actually wanted to position it there. It may not seem like a big deal, but any little waste of time, any little advantage you can give yourself is absolutely worth it. And if you don't need to be setting up your MG, just don't feel like you have to set up your MG. Now as we see right here, a little bit more aggressive of an opening from our American player, and if we look at the fuel income, we actually don't have any of the plus 10s right now. We had a little bit in the early game with this plus 10. If we look down here, we have 84 fuel in the bank right now. That can get us to tier 2, and in a few minutes that'll be able to get us to tier 3, but beyond that we're going to be in a little bit of trouble. We're definitely not going to see the ideal, optimal, super early 9 or 10 minute Puma that we saw in the Aimstrong game, and that you should be aiming for in a strategy such as this, but which may not always be accessible and may not always be possible. But it doesn't mean you actually have to do anything radically different with the strategy. You still play it out just like you would before. If we look at the mine placement, we had a mine there, we have a mine here, we have a mine right here, we have another mine going down right here. These are all very popular flanking locations, and on a map like Langres, where you actually have to be fairly worried about how your opponent's going to be flanking you, because if we look at the tactical map for a minute here, we have a lot of routes that our American opponent could actually come down. We have this area right down here, we have here, here, all the way over here, even down here, over here, even down here, and even all the way around here. If your opponent wants to be what's the word I'm looking for? If he wants to be fancy about it, if he really wants to flank you, and he wants to do it seriously, he definitely can. And there's a lot of room for him to be able to do that. And if we look at Tommy's munitions right now, he's got a decent income. He's at 32 right now. He's got the 3 plus 10 points that he really wants. These 3 right here. He would like this plus 16, but at this point it's a little difficult for him to commit to holding this right hand side, which has the fuel that he's going to need to cap and hold in order to make his tier 3 transition a success, while at the same time holding on to this left hand side. But if we look at the manpower just in terms of what's in the bank right now, we have a very low, not manpower rather, but munitions. We have a very low munitions surplus right now. We have a lot of mines. We have another mine to go down right there. You can see right there that squad hitting a mine there. Do we have more mines? I think we have one more mine. No, I believe we'll have another mine down here. But the main point that I'm trying to make is, without mines, you're really not going to be able to defend these very heavy flanks. You'll notice right here, what do we have in terms of defense right now? We have 2 MGs, we have a few piles, we have a sniper, and we have a Schwimmwagen. Without these mines, the grenades that our American player Tech 2 and has been attempting to flank with would be a lot more powerful. Imagine that flank with this rifle squad and that rifle squad, the 2 squads that hit those 2 mines, still able to fight. It would be far more difficult. We'd have a squad coming up here, we'd have a squad coming down here, in addition to the squad coming here and the squad coming there. And with 2 MGs, both of which are extremely vulnerable to grenades, MGs, especially this patch, with the reduced scatter on grenade throws, are very difficult to use against early grenade plays without some sort of Volk support, or mine support, obviously. And when we talk about a strategy such as this, where we're avoiding Volk support for some very good and conscious reasons, those being our desire to be cost effective, our desire to reduce veterancy for our opponent, and our desire to reduce manpower drain on ourselves, we realize we really need those MGs in order to give ourselves a fighting chance against super aggressive and even mildly aggressive. This isn't super aggressive, this isn't bars and grenades. This is a little bit of aggression, a little bit of pressure applied by an American player who's probably teching behind this. We saw the Triage Center in the base. Tommy got a glimpse of that. We're probably going to see some sort of motor pool M8 tech behind this. This is very similar, if not the exact same build as Korean Army's 3 rifle grenade to 4th rifle with the triage build that we went over in one of the earlier Strat Talk episodes. And a strategy such as that is going to want to transition out of infantry aggression into something a bit more substantial, because infantry aggression, unless you really commit to it all out, can't really sustain itself against Wehrmacht tech, be it tier 3, tier 2, anything like that. Unless you go all out, it's very difficult to make American infantry and aggressive infantry strategically viable throughout the early game and into a mid game. Now, as we see right here, that was a fairly successful flank by our American player. Even despite the mines, we had slightly less effective mine coverage that second flank. The very forward mines, the aggressive mines, were no longer in place because they had been hit before. The mine over here, the mine over here. We didn't really have any forward mines. We had very defensive mines, and those are going to come into play right here, as you can see. But we didn't really have the aggressive mines that we would have liked, and it's difficult, is what I'm trying to say, at all times to get the optimal mine coverage that you always want in all situations. The point is to be as diligent about it as you possibly can, and to cover as much of the map and as much of your vulnerable areas as you possibly can. Now right here we start running into the first little divergence between Aimstrong's and Tommy's interpretations of the strengths and weaknesses of this strategy. We saw in the previous game Aimstrong elect for an upgun Puma for his primary form of AT, and favoring rather the use of his stormtroopers in a supplementary anti-infantry role, which was evident by the MP44 upgrade and the way Aimstrong was using his infantry in combat with other infantry and trying to avoid the M8, and trying to avoid vehicular conflict with his unit for as long as possible. This is fundamentally different to Tommy's desire to get right now one Panzerschreck on his Schreck squad, and we're going to see from his Puma no upgun, and that's obviously a conscious decision to rely more on the Puma, the vehicle unit, for anti-infantry, and less on the infantry unit, and using the infantry unit more for anti-tank. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you which one's better. I'm not going to sit here and tell you you should do one or you should do the other. What I'm going to say is I encourage you, if you do decide that this is a strategy that you may want to practice and attempt to become good with, to try both ways. Try stormtroopers with Panzerschrecks and regular Pumas. Try upgun Pumas and Stugs. Try different combinations of tier 3 units, because one of the most difficult, one of the reasons this strategy is difficult to execute, because this is a difficult strategy to execute. I didn't really talk too much about difficulty earlier because I wanted to focus on the core characteristics of the strategy. But in terms of execution, this strategy is extremely difficult. You need good MG micro, you need good bike micro, you need good sniper micro, and you need to be active and diligent with your pioneers at all times. Now you have 4 pioneers, and those 4 pioneers are generally speaking going to be all around the map. So you have a lot of pioneers in a lot of really good places, so you can lay a lot of mines, and it's not too difficult. But on top of that, you need to be able to micro your MGs well. You need to understand. Sorry, I guess I should look at something slightly interesting instead of building. But yeah, you need to at least slightly understand when you want to be pushing, when you want to be holding back, when you want to be retreating, and stuff like that. And you need to be good with your snipers. You need to know when you can retreat those, when you should be cloaking them, when you need to be decloaking them, when you can decloak them, and stuff like that. And you need to know what you want to be doing and what you need to be focusing on at each phase of the game, because a strategy like this strategy in particular, has 3 phases that you need to be worried about. Alright? The early phase, I need to survive to get my tier 3 out. That's your primary goal with a strategy such as this, where your tier 1 units, your early game units, are there to boost you quickly into tier 3. That's the reason for us going for these very support heavy units, these very cheap units in terms of manpower cost and in terms of veterancy cost toward our opponents. We're trying to be as cheap as possible because we want to get to tier 3 as quickly as possible and with as much strength as possible. So with that in mind, your first goal, I need to survive to get to tier 3. Because once I get to tier 3, I become strong. Beyond that,
We have 300 points left.
once we've taken care of getting to tier 3, we need to survive the M8. We need to survive our opponent's tech, our opponent's aggressive move, be it an M8, be it heavy infantry with maybe elite infantry support, be it even a rush to tank depot in some situations. We need to be able to survive that, and that comes down mainly to tier 3 unit and vehicle control. And this is an extremely difficult part of this strategy that goes right along with the ability to micro MGs effectively, to micro snipers effectively, to micro bikes effectively, and to micro all 3 together. Just the idea and the notion that you really need to deal with the M8, to deal with the Bard infantry and rangers, say, to deal with the Shermans, and you need to do them with tier 3 units, because the caveat that we've made with this strategy is we're saying this is going to be more difficult. We acknowledge that it's going to be more difficult to use Pumas, to use Stugs, to use Stews to defend against American tech, because it is going to be more difficult. It's a lot easier from an execution point of view to spam Vet 3 Grens. Alright, you build a bunch of Grenadiers, you get some Panzerschrecks on them, you get veterancy, and hey, they're pretty good against infantry, they're pretty good against vehicles. It's the best of both worlds, but in a situation like that, the problem with that as you improve and as you start playing better players is the fact that a strategy like that can be countered. Your opponent, if he plays properly, is going to be able to beat you because a strategy like that is beatable. Your opponent has to play better than you, of course, but your opponent can beat you, and it's not difficult per se. I mean, anything, you know, relative degrees of difficulty, I don't really want to get into. Yeah, this isn't difficult, that is difficult kind of thing. But your opponent can beat you if he plays properly with a fairly simple to use strategy. Like, let's continue with the Vet 3 Grens kind of analogy, I suppose. Whereas a strategy such as this, it's much more difficult for your opponent to counter correctly if you play it correctly. You can play Gren spam extremely well and still lose, because if your opponent just counters you, he's going to have an advantage in terms of pure units that you're not going to have, because you chose an easier to execute strategy that has some holes in it in terms of what it can counter easily and what it gets countered easily by. Whereas a strategy such as this, it's a lot more difficult to execute. It's very difficult, and actually, if any of you have been watching my stream and watch me attempt this strategy, one of my main problems with this strategy personally, in terms of execution, is understanding when and how to use my tier 3 units. It's a tech tree that I'm not very adept at using independent of tier 2 support. And it's very different playing tier 3 with tier 2 support than it is playing tier 3 without tier 2 support. Because you need to fill the holes that tier 2 support fills with tier 3 units instead, which, if you play it properly, is going to be better. And the main reason for that is the way repairing works in Company of Heroes. You spend a extremely minimal, minute amount of manpower. It's essentially non-existent, the manpower cost associated with actually repairing units. It might as well not be there. And that's of course in direct contrast to the relatively almost infinitely more expensive manpower cost of infantry, because you're paying a fairly large fairly large amount of manpower for the ability to constantly be able to have infantry on the field and be able to actually do damage with that infantry. The same cost is not associated with vehicles. In Company of Heroes, once a vehicle is made, it's pretty much a one-time upfront cost. Outside of that, your vehicle is essentially free damage. And the more vehicles you have, as long as you don't lose the vehicles, because that's the trade-off you make. If you lose the vehicles, you can't reinforce them, obviously. I mean, you can repair them if they get damaged, but if you lose the vehicles, they're gone. And it ends up being a far more expensive cost than an infantry squad, say, because an infantry squad can retreat a lot easier. It requires relatively less micro, because you throw it into cover, you have a lot of them, you put it in cover, you can just hit a hotkey and you retreat it. Whereas a vehicle, of course, you need to be constantly microing it. You have to pay attention and be careful about how hard you push and things like that. So in terms of difficulty of use, it's far more difficult to use tier 3 units. They're far more powerful, however, far more cost effective. They don't give your opponent veterancy, obviously, unless they die, of course. But your opponent doesn't get veterancy for damaging them. They can soak up things like munitions from sticky bombs. They can occupy attention from elite infantry and stuff like that. So I kind of got sidetracked from my 3 steps that you want to be keeping in mind when you're using this strategy. Now, of course, the first one, just to go over it again, is surviving to tier 3. I need to survive to tier 3. I need to have the fuel I need in order to get to tier 3 in a timely fashion. Because if I delay it too much, my opponent's going to be able to counter it too strongly with something like a lot of tank TP units, something like that, and it's just going to be too difficult. Beyond that, once we've survived to tier 3, we need to survive whatever our opponent's tech choice has been. So we need to survive his infantry, we need to survive his M8, we need to find some way to deal with the M8, to deal with a Sherman, to deal with whatever our opponent decides to commit to as his tech investment, let's call it. And beyond that, once we've dealt with that, once we've survived to tier 3, we've dealt with whatever our opponents decided to throw at us, we need to be aggressive, and we need to know when to be aggressive and how aggressive to be. And this is exactly what I'm talking about right here. The Stu is the perfect vehicle for aggression. Tier 3 units, if you micro them well, as I've mentioned, I'm going to keep mentioning it because it's an extremely important point, they're free damage. Even if you lose the squad, even if you lose the vehicles, in this case, knowing when it's perfectly economical and absolutely worth it for you to not necessarily throw away a couple Stus, or throw away a Stu, or throw away a Puma, or a Stug like we saw in the Aimstrong game. It's simply understanding windows of opportunity. And this mainly comes from practice. I can't really tell you, and to be completely frank, this is not a strong suit of mine, so I would feel disingenuous actually suggesting, you know, this is a good rule of thumb to play when you need to be aggressive, stuff like that, because it's extremely difficult. It's not an easy thing to do, to know when you should be aggressive and when you should be passive, especially with regards to vehicles, which are high investment, high risk, high reward relative to infantry type units. But it's an extremely important, extremely vital, and And it's an aspect of the strategy that makes it as powerful as it is. The ability to know, hey, I need to be aggressive here, or hey, I can be aggressive here. I can do damage right now, and there's really nothing my opponent can do about it. The easiest kind of example that I can think of is simply picking off that first barracks. In most situations, the stew comes early enough for you to be able to push in, take out the barracks, and get out with the stew alive. That's a generally alright rule to follow, is provided you get your stew in a timely manner. The moment you hit 4 CPs, shortly after that you're able to afford the stew, and your opponent hasn't done something completely ridiculous like 3 rifles and then an AT gun or something like that. More often than not, you will be able to push forward, and even if your opponent has a lot of units, he might have a lot of rifles, he might have an M8, you'll be able to do some damage, because a stew is a high damage in a short period of time type unit. It punishes your opponent for not being prepared in advance, because you can't really react to a stew and prevent it from doing any damage at all unless you've been proactive in trying to prevent that stew from doing any damage. Like, if I start sticky bombs and an AT gun the moment I see a stew, and that stew walks right up to my barracks and starts shooting at it, it's going to kill it. It's going to kill that barracks before I get my sticky bombs and before I get my AT gun. And even if I do, say, have fast deployment from Armor Company with my AT gun, it's going to be able to kill that barracks before I can kill the stew. And that's free damage. And a lot of players who use the stew are very good at using the stew on the field, but don't realize, hey, I can walk into my opponent's base right now. What can my opponent do about it? He can't really do anything at all. And if that's something you struggle with, if that's something you don't really know if you do properly, because you probably don't, and I'm not saying that to be mean, because I don't do it properly. A lot of players don't do it properly, even at extremely high levels of play. Aimstrong is one of the players that's extremely valuable to watch in that regard, and I would absolutely recommend you check out his replay packs, any replays you can get your hands on, because it's an art to figuring out when I should base rush my opponent, when I should attack, when I shouldn't attack, especially with vehicles, because it's a lot more difficult to change your mind. You can't just tap a hotkey when you've got 2 vehicles in your opponent's base and they both get sticky, because if your opponent has tanks and you have 2 stews and they both get sticky and your opponent has like 2 M18s, you're gonna lose both those stews. You can't just retreat and you walk into a base, you get suppressed. Oh well, I hit my T button, I run back home, I maybe lose a few men, but I don't lose the squads. That doesn't happen with vehicles, and that's why people are a lot less willing to be experimentally aggressive with vehicles, because it's such a high risk. Even though it's such a high reward, the risk is always going to be there, and it comes down to minimizing that risk as much as you can. And as we saw in the Aimstrong game, sometimes that risk actually doesn't really pay off. Aimstrong said, hey, I'm going to take a bit of a chance here. I'm going to run in with my Stug and Puma, and if my opponent's not ready for me, maybe he skimped on sticky bombs. He doesn't have sticky bombs yet. This is a very short time after me having built my Puma and my Stug. It's not like I've waited 10 minutes after I built those units to run into his base. Maybe he's been a little greedy to try to get an earlier infantry upgrade out, something like that. Just the possibility of your opponent not doing something he should be doing, and the pressure that puts on your opponent, and what that forces your opponent to do, because your opponent can't cut corners if he knows you're going to call him on it if he does. And even if you do call him on it and he says, hey, I did what I needed to do, you're not going to be able to do much, you can still take advantage of that situation in other ways. We saw from capping territory to getting into an advantageous position, planting offensive mines, cutting off territory, stuff like that. and the cost effectiveness of your early game with your MGs, with your snipers, with your support units allows you to be a bit more reckless with your vehicles because you just have a lot of manpower. You are in a very good spot economically because you've played a economically focused strategy, and you've said, hey, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure I have more manpower than my opponent because I'm going to be spending less manpower on maintaining my army and more manpower on improving and expanding my army. And that's the main difference between an American mid-game, where a lot of manpower goes into maintaining, it goes into reinforcing Puma, or not Pumas, Rangers, rifles, engineers, whereas you as the Wehrmacht player saying, instead of spending 300 manpower on reinforcing, I'm going to spend 50 manpower on reinforcing and get another Puma out. And I'm going to have a bit more map control, I'm going to be able to do a bit more damage, and if I micro these units better, it's going to be hard. I'm going to have a lot of units, and their vehicles, they're relatively fragile. I'm going to need to micro them well, I'm going to need to play well, but if I do that, it's going to be extremely difficult for my opponent to actually do anything about it. And that's the main philosophy of a strategy like this, and that's one of the reasons why I really like it, and I think it's very interesting to look at from the perspective of someone who is always looking and always trying to find a strategy that just puts more control into the hands of the player executing it and takes control out of the hands of the player defending it. And with that, that's about all I want to say with this strategy. Hopefully, I actually don't know how long this video took, but hopefully it's not an hour. I don't think it's an hour. It's not nearly as late tonight as it was the last time I finished. So that's a good sign. But thank you guys for watching. And as always, questions, comments, stuff like that, please do post them. I very much would like to hear from you guys. If you have any questions or concerns, I will most definitely answer them to the best of my abilities. I am streaming still quite frequently over on Twitch TV rather, twitch.tv/InverseTV. So stop on by if you want to see some of these strategies in action. I do my best to explain my thought process while I'm executing such strategies. But aside from that, that's about it. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.